All right, I will say hello and welcome back to another episode of All About Balance. And today I am rejoined by the one and only Rosi Sexton. Rosie, how's it going?
Good, really busy. So I've been the last few months feel like they've flown by because everything's just been really hectic. The good kind of busy mostly, but busy.
So, what has been taking your time most prominently?
Work has been incredibly busy. Actually, I've been busier than I've ever been since becoming an osteopath. And I think that's a combination of people. A lot of people who've been at home for a year, sort of hunched over a dining room table, and staring at a laptop,
Mhm.
and now they're starting to get back out and do things again, and maybe doing a little bit too much too soon and realizing that their body isn't quite where it was 12 or 18 months ago. I've had lots of sporting injuries, gardening injuries, walking the dog injuries.
Sure.
It's the full works really. And like I say, people who've just realised that actually, they're not moving around as much as they were
Mm.
before lockdown, and that's affected their body in various different ways. So, like I say, in terms of work, I mean, I'm being a little bit careful here because you never want to be negative about getting more work when you're self-employed, right?
Sure.
Uh, but I think there's a balance, when we talk about work life, um, and trying to make sure that it's sustainable as well, because I mean it does feel like there's a few weeks where I've been pretty much flat out, and I mean as the saying goes, when you're self-employed, the great thing is that you get to work whichever 7 days a week you want,
Mm.
um, and
Yes.
I may have said this before, but yeah, um, I think it's it's trying to find that sort of balance between, the problem is when the work's there, you want to take it because you're never sure how things are going to go in the future. You're never sure sort of where we're headed. But I mean, the way I'm seeing things at the moment, I don't think that demand is going to go anywhere anytime soon.
Mm.
Um, I think there's also some really significant challenges in the health service at the moment, and I mean this probably sort of crosses over into my political role a little bit as well. And I'm seeing some of the things going on behind the scenes, um, with how that's all shaking out. And I think there's going to be a really huge role for people like myself who see people face to face, because um, a, a lot of the health services are moving away from automatically seeing people face to face all the time as a default. And so with things like back pain, there's a limit to what you can do over a phone call, and people want to feel like somebody's had a good look at it and can at least reassure them that it's nothing serious to worry about. And so I think because of some of those issues that I'm seeing going on, I think um, I'm going to be as busy as I want to be for some time, which is, like I say again, for me, the additional challenge there is balancing that up against what I'm doing politically, my work as a counsellor, and I've also taken on another role now as well, because I've been asked to the deputy chair role for the LGA independent group. The LGA is the Local Government Association, on the Community Wellbeing Board, which sounds like a mouthful, but what that basically means is, I mean, the Local Government Association have quite a strong lobbying voice when we're talking about policy change. And when the government's talking about various policies, the LGA will often get consulted, because the local government are often the people who are having to deliver some of these
Mhm.
changes. And the way that local government forms its views and opinions that go through to that process is via various boards. And the Community Wellbeing Board is the one that looks at all the health service changes, all the basically anything to do with health and well-being. And yeah, so sort of as one of the lead members on that board, I'm now being invited to some really quite interesting meetings about various things that are going on behind the scenes, and those basically those health and social care reform, public health reform, all of those bits, which is on the one hand very interesting. It feels like a lot of pressure, actually. It feels like quite a big responsibility because
Sure.
I was in a meeting with Andrea Ledson the other day on a Zoom meeting, and it was just a small group, and we were talking about a particular area of policy. And when you've got, maybe 3 or 4 minutes to say something to somebody in government that may affect the way that they think about policy, that feels like a big responsibility to get right.
Yeah.
It's trying to figure out how best to use that platform and to use that role, which is, like I said, I've got a huge long reading list at the moment, which I'll be trying to chip into this weekend, just to get up to speed with that.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of points to make. The first is, I have a question based on what you said, and we'll get to that after. But the second is, many people say that they're busy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're actually busy.
I mean, busy is relative, right? It's
Yeah, well, of course, yeah, of course.
I think, the interesting thing, being self-employed, and I manage my own diary, so I have almost complete discretion over everything that I do. I can choose to do something or not to do something. Obviously, not doing things has consequences. But I keep having this conversation with partner Steve, and he says, you need to see fewer people. So I could do that. I could just turn down some appointments, block out some time, take half a day off, take a day off. I keep saying I'm going to get back the bank holidays that I worked at some point, but we'll see if that actually happens. So yeah, I could do that. But I suppose it's a question of feeling like there's in a way the huge privilege of that is that everything I do feels meaningful because I'm choosing to do it.
Yes.
That if I don't want to do something, if something feels pointless, I just won't do it. Like I said, that's that's an exceptionally privileged position to be in. I do recognise that. At the same time, it's always that feeling of, who am I letting down if I don't do this? Which is the flip side of that.
Yeah, my point was going to be, you've chosen to do something, or chosen is a difficult word. You've worked extremely hard to get to a position where you can do something that you're passionate about for money, right? But obviously money isn't the primary receptor here. The reason that you're doing this thing is because you want to make a positive change in your community and in the world, right? And I think busy comes at a couple of detriments, but also some positives. The positive is that the transaction that you're making is extreme fatigue, but extreme fatigue on a return of doing fantastic things for people, right? Like you mentioned earlier that you think when you see somebody in person, when they're talking about something like back pain or whatever, then they get a much more positive experience because they feel like it's been examined properly, right? Well, if you're seeing 15 people a day or 10 people a day, and you're also going to these meetings, and you're also, chipping away at your 10,000 page reading list, and all of this stuff, well, you can get into bed that evening knowing that all of the hours of that day was spent doing something meaningful, not just for yourself, but also for other people, right? And I think that's a kind of tiredness that brings you solace rather than keeps you awake, if that makes sense.
I think, that's the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning, is that feeling of being able to make a difference. And obviously, sort of across what I do, there are some areas where it's much easier to make a difference than others, and there's some things that you do that feel, you go away with that buzz because you feel like you've really made a difference either to that individual or in a wider sense with some of those meetings. Something I've said has been taken on board. You say, right, that's made a positive difference in the community. I mean, there's some incredible examples. If you get somebody who's in chronic pain, I've had a few examples recently where somebody's been in pain for literally years, and they've come in, they've sort of resigned themselves to always being in pain, and they're seeing me as sort of the last ditch. And it just happens to be something where, the right thing, the right time can make a real difference, and it can change that person's life.
Yep.
And I mean, on the one hand, it feels like I say, a huge privilege to be in a position to do that. It's also a huge responsibility because, you've got people who are coming to see me, and I'm aware that those people are paying out of their own pocket.
Of course.
And what for a lot of people is quite a large amount of money,
Yep.
So it's one of those things where, if you just turn up at work, there are times when you're on form and there are times when you just sort of turn it in a bit. It's like, oh, I'm tired today, and you just go through the motions. And I always know that I can't do that because for that person in front of me, that might be, they might have been looking forward to that appointment for weeks. That's their opportunity to get a bit of relief from this pain they've been experiencing.
Yeah.
Or again, if I'm in a meeting, that might be the one opportunity to say something on that particular policy that's actually really important, that nobody else is going to pick up if I don't say it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that sort of feeling of having to be always on. I can't just turn up and go through the motions. And I think that's one of the things that's particularly exhausting about some of what I do. And also that sort of sense of, I've always got people bringing me their problems, and in a nice way. And actually, that's what I do well. I think solving other people's problems is always so much easier than solving your own, right?
100%. Yeah.
But, I think that's something that, I naturally gravitate towards, and I feel like I can really, help with. But again, at the same time, it's that sort of sense of responsibility that at times, sometimes you do just need to take a break. And again, I think that's important as well, because by not taking a break, it means that I'm not in a position to, be on form for next week's client. So it's one of those things. It's not an easy balance to get.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, the elephant in the room also is that you have a family, and all the commitments that come along with having a family. I think you touched on, essentially, you said you're an empath, right? And I think that in a professional empath, I guess, and that makes a lot of sense from our conversation last year. You sort of touched on how you've always sort of been like this, as in you always take on the most difficult challenge and then try to be the best that you can be, whether it be, the degree or playing music or fighting MMA or whatever it is, right? You want to try and be the best at whatever you're attempting to be. And I think the two roles that you're predominantly and professionally undertaking, both the council work and now LGA work and the osteo work, you're shouldering some of the highest amounts of responsibility that you can in the capacity that you're working in, right? Like somebody coming to you as an osteo, they're not coming for a coffee and a chat, right? They're not coming because they just want to sit down and see you, right? They're coming because they have a problem, and a problem that's causing them a block or a diversion in their life, right? And that in itself is a huge responsibility. But also, when you go to your councillor meetings, and specifically now your LGA meetings, where, as you say, you have a 3-minute window to make a change to thousands of people, that's a lot of responsibility as well, right? And I mean, I'm grateful it's you doing it and not me, frankly.
I mean, on the one hand, there's a sense in which I really enjoy it.
Of course.
there is that sort of excitement, that buzz from feeling as though you've got a voice in some of these really important discussions. And when I think, how many community groups or how many individuals would love to have that FaceTime with, even somebody at council level who makes decisions about things important to their life. Never mind somebody at, in Westminster. So actually having that FaceTime to sit down and tell somebody something that's important about that policy that they're designing. And like I say, it's a huge opportunity. So it's something that you always want to feel like, okay, how am I making the most of this? And again, it's one of those things where it would be very easy just to turn up and turn it in. You turn up at the meetings, you nod it through. And I can think of councillors who do that. They just turn up at the meetings, they don't really say anything, they go through the motions, everything gets nodded through. But again, it's that wasted opportunity, and nobody's really holding you to account on an individual level. That's what it all comes down to, your personal sense of, well, the change that you want to make in the world. And like I say, if I turned up to a meeting having not read the agenda and just sort of sat there and didn't say much, nobody's going to tell me off or call me. I'm not going to get a performance review at the end of the year. I suppose the performance review is the election, but most of the time people aren't watching that closely. What you're doing in individual meetings, for example. They're open to the public, and for any listeners here, I would highly recommend trying to watch a few of your local council meetings and things like that, and actually sort of get that sense of what's going on, because I think you can really see, and there are good and bad councillors across all political groups actually. So seeing who's there and who's doing the work and who's really sticking their neck out and who's just taking a back seat, trousering the allowance and nodding things through, there's it's definitely worth paying attention to that. But I also appreciate that everyone's got busy lives. It's not just me that's busy, especially at the moment. Everyone's got lots of things to think about, work and family and things, and their own health. And people don't have the capacity to pay attention to all this. So I think when we talk about people not understanding what's going on, it's not because people don't have the capacity to understand. It's people a lot of the time don't have the time, don't have the mental energy on top of everything else that they're doing. And I think that's, again, why it's such a responsibility to be in that position, because you're entrusting somebody to go to those meetings for you and to speak up for you and to make those decisions for you. And again, it may be that nobody actually pays attention to that, but it's doing it as well as you can anyway.
Yeah, and that sort of filters into what we were saying about the empathy stuff, right? Like, people are expecting, I think one of the primary traits that community members look for in a politician is to feel like they're understood and listened to, right? And the subsidiary of that is trust, right? That they trust that you're going to go to these meetings and you're going to attempt to voice their opinions on their behalf. And of course, I'm sure there are careerist politicians who, go and sit and don't say anything. And I think that's, that you're going to find those people regardless of what role you're in, right? Regardless of what situation you're into. So, yeah, the one question I did have, and I've careered off vastly, is you mentioned that there are some big challenges that are coming up in terms of the health service. Do you mind speaking on what you think those are?
I think when you look at it across the board, we've got a health service that has been chronically underfunded for years and under-resourced.
Yep.
Looking at GPs, which is one of the really hot issues at the moment, I think, certainly in Solihull, I think in lots of areas of the country as well, though. GPs have been I'm being slightly careful about how I put this, but I think primary care, which is, you know, GP care, has been underfunded and under-resourced for years now. We had a GP crisis before COVID. You know, people were finding it harder and harder to get an appointment with their doctor. You find that continuity of care, so your ability to go and see the same doctor that you talked to about your problem last time, that's been eroded. There's fewer people going into profession. I mean, the government promised to have, you know, however many thousand more GPs. That's not happened. We've got fewer GPs, and you know, in terms of sort of GPs per person, and you know, for the amount of need there is in the community, that's still decreasing. You've got a lot at the moment who are burnt out from the whole crisis and leave the profession. So this has been something that's been building for a long time. Now, when COVID hit, there were obviously sort of changes in the short term. So a lot of GP care shut down temporarily and then sort of reintroduced on a remote basis. So people were having to speak to the GP by phone. And actually, for some problems, that's a really good solution, because for some things you don't need to see GP face to face. You know, if you've got 3 young children and you're talking about something that can just as easily be handled by phone, sometimes that actually might be more convenient for you. So having the ability to talk to your GP on the phone is not a bad thing. Yeah. But what has been problematic is that people have been sort of pushed towards that in some cases where they felt, actually, you know what, I need to see somebody face to face, either because I'm not explaining this very well and I don't feel like I'm being understood properly here, or because, you know, I just want somebody to have a look at it and to reassure me that this isn't something I should worry about. I think because of that, it's been really difficult for people. People have felt cut off from their GP and not always had the ability to get in to see them. This has varied a lot over the country, by the way. So some people will be listening to this and thinking, well, I haven't had any problems. And it may be that they haven't. But in other areas, there's been sort of really big issues. So I think it's the problem that we're seeing is that I don't think things are going to go back to sort of the pre-COVID normal anytime, perhaps ever. You know, we're not going to be in that situation where access to GPs works the way it did before. The NHS are talking about what they call total triage, which is where, you know, you have to sort of get through that gatekeeper in order to book the appointment in the first place. And again, you know, there are problems with access there are problems with potential equality implications. You know, these are all things that I've been talking about endlessly in meetings. And I see the end result of that in the clinic, actually, because when people can't get in to see their GP, some of them will turn up at my clinic, you know, and that's one of the things that's driving that increase in, you know, the number of people I've been seeing. So I can tell some of those stories. I mean, obviously, you know, not the personal details, but I can explain, you know, these are the things that I'm seeing, and this is how it can all go horribly wrong. And I think, you know, there are no easy solutions to that, because on the one hand, as I said, the precautions that GPs have had to put in place over COVID and some of the other things have been going on, you know, the demands of the vaccination programme as well, have meant that there has been less capacity there. And there's also been more demand, particularly as we've come out of the lockdown, because, I mean, for the same reasons that I've been experiencing more demand in clinic, you know, people, and when people have put off dealing with health issues, a lot of those health issues have become worse. So they've needed more treatment and more, you know, attention from the GPs. So that's meant that, you know, more demand and less capacity has meant that people have often struggled to get access. And I think those are some of the challenges that we're seeing. GPs have felt massively overloaded. I know from the point of view of some of the doctors I know, they're struggling as well. And I mean, it doesn't help that actually the media have looked at this problem, and in many sense. They blamed the doctors for it. Said, oh, the GPs have been closed. Why aren't they seeing patients face to face? And it's like, well, it's more complicated than that. And again, it's that, presenting an easy answer that people grab onto. And again, it's not that people are stupid. It's that people have other demands. People have lots of other things to think about. So they don't always go in and do the digging and, research the area for themselves. A lot of the time they'll take, that thing that they're being told by the media, and they'll just assume that they're being told that correctly, which again is one of the things. I mean, this sort of gets me off on a track of why the media have a responsibility, and sometimes that responsibility is not being met, I think. But yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's fair to use the word media anymore, because what media used to be was what you and I would like it to be now, aka an accurate representation of a complicated issue.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it's without bias, because that's very difficult to achieve. However, presenting both sides of an argument and presenting the facts of an argument, and then maybe your conclusion has your own personal opinion in it, fine. Fine. That's kind of the point of you being a writer. But that's not the case now. The words printed in media, quote unquote, is entirely derived around money and pushing agendas, right? And that's not the point.
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge, actually, because a lot of what you see out there, as you say, there's no balance there. It's a mixed bag, right? So, you have really bad examples and you have better examples, but across the board, I think there's a real problem with, there's a lot of opinion that's being presented as fact. And again, a lot of cases where things have not been well researched, but it may be that a particular angle on something will sell newspapers. And so somebody's going to do that. Whether it's accurate or not, whether it serves the public interest or not, if it sells newspapers, well, and
there's money to be made. Yeah.
And again, I mean, the other problem is when there's so many voices out there, because we're not just talking about the traditional print media or traditional broadcast media. You've got every blogger on the internet. You've got social media, you've got, all of those voices as well competing for airtime. And I think people will tend to gravitate towards things that grab attention. And the things that grab people's attention are the things that spark strong emotion, whether that's fear or outrage or, anger. And those are the things that people will focus on. So even if you've got 99 out of 100 headlines are well balanced, well researched, responsible reporting, and that one isn't, that one is going to get a disproportionate amount of people's attention. So again, you've got that selection bias, which in itself then drives people more towards that kind of sensationalist reporting, because that's what grabs people's attention. That's what gets your words in front of more viewers, which then drives advertising revenue. It drives, publicity for your media outlet, and so on and so on. So I think that's a real challenge. And again, I don't have any very good solutions to what we do about that, because I think it's almost one of those sort of slight bugs in the human operating system, isn't it? It's when I say bugs, I mean it was evolutionarily adaptive at one point for us to pay attention to the thing that was sparking that strong emotion. You know, I think when we lived in small bands in hunter-gatherer communities, you know, that made absolute sense. But now, when you've got access to information from across the planet, and news about what 7 billion people are doing, that's paying selective attention to the bits that make you angry is going to become exhausting, because there will always be things going on that spark that strong emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the most relevant to your individual life. It doesn't mean that that's actually what you should be paying attention to in terms of, you know, and it doesn't mean that it's accurate as well, because like I say, you know, these days we get most of that information secondhand. You know, it's not from that trusted source in our own village who we know personally. It's from somebody who, you know, we may have heard of, but that quality control and that sense of, you know, is this accurate? Is this fair? We've lost that individual accountability, I think.
I think the thing to just bolt on to what you've said is that the sort of the fourth piece of string to this is algorithm. There's algorithmic marketing that's entirely dependent on the four things that you've just mentioned, right? You have people, consumers, searching for emotion. You have writers writing for emotion. You have producers, aka, you know, media outlets and conglomerates, searching for money. And then you have algorithm searching for interaction.
Yeah.
And
absolutely,
when
yeah.
all four of those things can make money, the likelihood of keeping a sanctity of truth is very minimal.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point of there's no easy answer, you're right, there's no easy answer to end solution or like complete solution. However, I think one of the first things that can be changed is the algorithms, right? Because at the base of all of this, the underwriter is the algorithm. If the algorithm wasn't determining that what was being presented to you was something that was going to trigger an emotion,
yeah,
especially a heavily reactive emotion,
yeah,
then the precedent would be shifted slightly and it would be less profitable, both tangibly and intangibly, for the other three strands to either look for or organize writing that would elicit such a reactive response. However, as it seems that the algorithm is our current overlord, I think the last thing to change would probably
I think that's a really good point. And I think, I mean, there have been some efforts to do things like that, particularly with regard to information about COVID. I think there's been sort of an acknowledgement that some of the misinformation doing the rounds is not in the public interest and actually potentially compromises public health. And I think some of the algorithm designers they've looked at ways to maybe flag some of the misinformation and sort of make people think more carefully before engaging in some of the things that are going around, and maybe I mean, again, I don't know the details of that. Like I say, I'm seeing that the way that people are interacting with some of that information around COVID has been different. You know, I think there's been efforts to make sure that people are signposted towards good sources of information, as well as, you know, what may be being presented on there and grabbing people's attention. So I think that there are people are exploring ways to do this. I'm not sure that that's happening in a sort of coherent sense across the board. It would be interesting to see sort of the outcomes of those individual cases. You know, I think, again, you know, in so many ways, COVID has been almost a test bed for lots of new ideas as things have come through. You know, I think it's really sparked a need for change in lots of areas. I mean, crises tend to drive change in general. You know, I think in times of crisis, you see change taking place in weeks and months that might, in ordinary time, take much longer. So I think because of that, you know, things have been pushed through, and I mean that comes with opportunities and costs. Right. I think there are some senses in which that's not a good thing. And, you know, we've talked about the issues that the health service are facing, some of the real challenges there. And like I say, you know, the frustrations that I have when I'm trying to sort of point out some of the problems with the way that we're going, and, you know, the worry that we're going to end up being pushed down a route that maybe isn't best for people. But at the same time, there's opportunities, and there's opportunities to explore things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise. And again, I wonder whether, you know, some of those things that are being tried could then be developed in other ways. So it'll be interesting.
I agree. And I think that nicely moves us on to the actual question I had for today, which was, you know, the one thing that COVID has shown me specifically is the furthering of division within communities, right? And I think this is a byproduct of the lockdown and the social distancing stuff. You touched on earlier, when we were in hunter-gatherer small communities, it was absolutely pertinent for us to focus on the things that were scary or fearful or would make us angry, or, you know, elicited such an aggravated emotional response. However, one of the things that I feel has changed quite dramatically is that now the thing that elicits such a remote response is being with people, right? Being in the presence of people. You know, I've seen from getting the tube or just walking around my local district, the way that people interact with each other is that it's uncommon to be around people, right? It's uncommon to have somebody within 2 feet of you, 3 feet of you, whatever it is. As a policy maker, and we can talk about all the subsidiary effects of what that would do to society, or what that has doing. How do you feel like we combat that?
I think this is a really big question, because I think there's a lot of different things going on here to unpick. I think the pandemic and the messaging that people have received over the pandemic, and, you know, the effects of lockdown, that's had a number of effects. I think one is it's driven a lot of interaction online during the lockdown. I think people have been engaged more via Zoom, for example, as well as via social media. And obviously there are opportunities there, you know, the ability to go to meetings and go to lectures that are happening on the other side of the world, you know, to meet people. I mean, there's been the ability to do that for quite a while, but it's become normalized. And in some ways that's a really good thing. There's lots of opportunities there. But I think the problem is it's not the same as being in a room with people, and our brains don't react to it in the same way as being in a room with people. I mean, something I've noticed is that council meetings, for example, get a lot more fractious, and there's a lot more irritable, for want of a word, when they're happening online than when you're in person. I think when you're in person, even with people who are on the opposite team, if you like, there's still that human interaction at a human level. You know, it's like we might not agree about lots of things, but I recognise you as a person. I think as soon as you move that online, you lose some of that, because that sort of sense of our brains, in exactly the same way that people tend to be more rude to each other on social media than they would if they were having that conversation face to face in somebody's living room or in the pub. You know, we've evolved ways of interacting with people face to face without wanting to kill each other all the time. You know, we've got those mechanisms. We haven't got those mechanisms online yet, because we haven't, you know, our brains haven't caught up with the technology. And I think that makes it, when discussions are being moved online, they do tend to get perhaps more irritable and more argumentative in some ways, unless people are less inclined to be conciliatory. And I think that makes a difference. I mean, again, it might be a different degree. It's like I say, I'm not talking about avert hostilities here necessarily, but it feels different. And I think that matters. And when you see that replicated across the whole of the country, in different forms, those community groups that have been meeting online or taking place, on online forums, they haven't had that same feel to them. And I think that's had an effect. Then you've got the fact that people have been told repeatedly that being in close proximity to other humans is a threat.
Yeah.
People are scary. I'm an introvert, so people are scary anyway. But,
Sure.
For lots of people, this is a new thing, and being told that having people sort of close to you and around you is a threat. Again, that's not going to make it easier to interact with people or to deal with people. And again, I think another factor is that the online focus and the way people have been getting information over the course of the pandemic. Again, we've moved from that localism where people are interacting with those in that network around them and spending time with people close to them, to where people are in online. And we know that being online tends to drive those heavily polarized tribes, if you like. So where people seek out people with very similar opinions to themselves. And that tolerance of difference and difference of opinion, I think, becomes less, because we're used to interacting predominantly with people who share our opinions. I mean, this is an interesting thing. I remember reading Rebel Ideas by Matt Syed, which is worth reading. And I think it's that he makes the point that in larger communities, people actually tend to become more polarized because there's more opportunity to seek out people who share your specific viewpoints, and there's less pressure to learn to live with people who are a bit different from yourself. So you can actually self-select into those smaller polarized groups, and I think that's nowhere is that more true than being online, because obviously you can interact with anyone in the world online, who has an internet connection. You can really sort of self-select down to a very granular level, people who are very similar to yourself. And in a sense, that can be, in one way, that can be wonderfully affirming for people who have sort of niche interests or niche concerns. You can find somebody who has the same set of problems that you have, and you can talk about how to deal with those. And actually, I mean, that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, it means that we're not being put in those groups where we have to get on with people who may be different from us. And again, this is something I notice in counselling. When you're in a room with people who, I'm in a room with a bunch of conservatives who we may disagree about lots of things, but actually learning how to disagree constructively and learning how to have those conversations where we can come to a point where those different viewpoints are being respected and acknowledged. I think there is a skill to that. There's and that's something that we lose when we're not in those sort of mixed groups, I think. And I think that's something that's been to some extent lost over the course of the pandemic. When you're in a small community group, there will be people there who agree with you, there'll be people who disagree with you, but you've got to learn to get on, because you've got a purpose that you want to come together for. And I think that's why those local groups, however, much we do things online, we can't lose sight of the fact that policy and politics happens locally, you know, in real space, you know, not in cyberspace. You know, we have to be able to get on with our neighbours, you know, literally. And this is one of the things that the Green Party talks about, actually, and one of the reasons that I am a Green as opposed to any of those other parties is that focus on localism and local communities, because I think that's really important. That sense of, you know, bringing people together to agree on, you know, what we're going to do locally, you know, whether it's what are we going to plant in this area of the park, or, you know, what policies are we going to have to look at, you know, improving active travel, or, you know, cycle infrastructure. I think having that ability to sort of bring people together is really, really important. And it's become harder over the course of the pandemic. And like I say, lots of things have moved online. You know, I'm addressing a meeting of a patient participation group for a primary care network. We've got that next week, and it's an online meeting. You know, it's a local group, but obviously because of COVID restrictions, those groups are still taking place online. And again, you lose all of that in-person interaction. And I'm wary, because I think there is that real danger that it can get very, very angry, because all of that emotion spills over. And whereas we've evolved ways to deal with strong emotion in in-person groups, we haven't got that for online groups in the same way. And I think that's one of the things that worries me. And I think we've been seeing some of that spilling over to those in-person interactions over the course of COVID. So a lot of the hostility that I think you mentioned earlier that we're seeing increasingly. And I mean, I think the same thing. You know, I've seen more racism in the last 18 months than I think I have in most of the rest of my adult life. And again, you know, I think that there may be other reasons for that, but I think, again, part of it is we've become quite insular.
I think one thing that tech does and online interaction does, in the same vein that it evokes your emotion, it's as if you had a panic button, right? You could keep pressing it. If the same level of panic is being emitted every time you hit the button, then panic becomes less panic, and you become more desensitized to the emotion, and you become used to the emotion. So, without, you know, turning this into a drug conversation, if you are pushed towards an emotion with every online interaction you have, whether that be because the algorithm is pointing you there, whether that be because of the media that you're interacting with, more and more you will become desensitized to the level at which you are feeling such an emotion. And that is negative, in my opinion, because you rightly mention that there is something vastly cathartic and vastly important to being in a room with people physically, because, you know, you're in a council meeting with somebody and somebody gets a bit shirty and whatever, well, you can guillotine them, and, you know, then they'll die.
Frowned upon.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. But I think that in a very real sense, the ownership of your words and your ownership of your actions becomes much less prevalent online, because there isn't a potential for physical reactions.
You don't feel as exposed, I think.
Right.
You know, even if in person, you know that person is not actually going to punch you in the face. I think on an evolutionary level, you know, we've adapted to have those conversations in a context where that might very well happen. Yes. And I think, you know, we react in that way, you know, I think, and I mean, that's not always a good thing, because I think, I mean, that's one of the drivers behind a lot of for example, when we're looking at sexism and the way that people treat male leaders compared to the way people treat female leaders,
Yes.
I suspect that some of that may come down to some of those evolutionary roots. Whereas if you look at somebody and you think, yeah, that person could have me in a fight, you treat them differently.
Sure.
Even if the chances of them actually doing that are in real terms as close to zero as makes no difference, your brain, those emotional bits of your brain don't know that. And I think there is that, sense of, people, I mean, and again, sort of moving away from the gender thing, even in terms of between different men, we know that men who are taller tend to do better in lots of aspects in life. And again, I think there is that sense of, if somebody looks physically dominant, people treat them differently. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think maybe moving things online moves away from that, where people feel maybe a subconscious sense of entitlement because they have that domineering presence. So in a way, I mean, it's one of those things where this is always more complicated. It's not as simple as saying this is good or this is bad. There are good and bad aspects to everything. So, like I say, I think in online meetings, it perhaps makes it easier for some of those more marginalised voices to speak up because they don't have that sense of, in the back of their mind, how somebody might react to them. But like I say, at the same time, the other side of that is we all tend to be, more less considerate of the feelings of those around us. And like I say, it's not as though things were perfect, because I think in-person groups, we're very selective as to whose feelings we consider based on how we perceive that person. There is an unspoken hierarchy there that may or may not correspond to the actual hierarchy. If we're in a situation where there's maybe formal hierarchy, that may be different, but there's also a sort of unspoken, maybe unacknowledged hierarchy, how we treat different people based on who we think might be most likely to punch us in the face, were we in that hunter-gatherer environment.
I mean, obviously that hierarchy, as you mentioned, pertains to much more than just who's going to punch us in the face, right? It's way more complicated.
Oh yeah.
But
I mean, in a modern sense, it's maybe who might be able to affect our career, or who might be able to sue us for money, or who might have other levers that they can push. So there is obviously much more to it, but I don't think we've lost that sense of that physical presence. But as I say, the online moves us away from that, which again creates a whole new dynamic.
Because the one of the issues you find when there is an issue with the positive side of online interaction, in that more marginalized voices can be heard, then marginalization becomes a power game. And it becomes well, I should speak because I'm more marginalized than you are, right? And then people will have some form of efficacy, and they will exaggerate the position of their marginalization in order to gain power over other people to then speak. And then it becomes another sense of dominance hierarchy. And where I find a real problem is, your point is fantastic, really, in that if you have a room full of people and you have 5 females who are under 5'5", and then everyone else is 7'1", right? Like as you say, the human predication to that is, well, I'm going to sit down, shut up, and I'm going to not speak my point. Whereas those points are the points of those 5 females are probably more valid, because the other points haven't been undertaken any checks and balances from somebody with a differing opinion, right? So having an online presence can be vastly important in that situation. But I just find that there is a dark side of the human psyche, which is to try and attain advantage, and I don't necessarily mean over other humans, but just personal advantage in a lot of ways. And I don't know how we counteract that.
I mean, it's difficult, right? Because any system can be gamed. Any set of rules put in place. You know, we've discovered this in MMA. You know, you put a set of rules in place, people will try to game them. People will try to get around those rules. That's the nature of humans. And you'll see the same thing. You know, any system you put in place to try and level that playing field, people will try to game that system. And you can try and put better systems in place that are harder to game. And we should do that, but it's not going to reduce the fact that that happens at all. I mean, this is something I spend a lot of time talking about as a politician, because you know, when we're talking about how to set up policy, you've got to talk about, you know, you can't just say, you know, for God's sake, just be reasonable. Sometimes you like to. Sometimes you like to, you know, oh, just for heaven's sake, you know, just can we just apply some common sense here? But you can't when you're talking about policy, because policy has to be, you know, something that you can actually, you know, look at and say, right, this is or this isn't. And again, this is the difficulty of moving from small groups to large groups in society, because the larger the group, the more things have to be concrete and written down and formalized. With small groups, you can have those informal arrangements, you can have those informal sort of sense of, and again, there's good and bad to that. You know, I think it does mean that, you know, certain voices tend to be prioritized over others. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be perfect, but we've kind of evolved ways, rough and ready ways of dealing with it, for better or worse. We haven't got that yet in terms of some of those larger groups. You know, we haven't evolved those more complex ways of ensuring on a subconscious level that we can get on with each other. And I mean, I think, to be honest, you know, given the scale of the challenge, actually humanity is not doing too badly. You know, we've got to look at this in perspective. You know, most of the time we don't kill each other. And actually that's an achievement which I think doesn't get enough credit. Most of the time we don't kill each other. Because, I mean, God knows that most of us would like to more often.
Sure.
I'm half joking, but but I think I've lost my train of thought now. But I think, you know, there is that serious point. That we've got to figure out how to do this better. And that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. There are always going to be those things that don't work quite as well as we would like them to. There's always going to be an element of people trying to game the system. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things. You know, it's the same way that, you know, just because people try to, you know, game the weight class system by cutting weight, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have weight classes. You know, having weight classes makes things fairer than they were before, even though it introduces problems. And I think the same thing is true with, you know, with areas of policy. You know, we should try to even things out. We should try to make sure that some of those maybe less commonly heard voices are heard. And we should also acknowledge that actually, to some of the people who are maybe more used to having their voice heard as a default, that can feel like oppression. And just because it feels like oppression, it doesn't mean that it is. And something we have to sort of take a rational look at it rather than an emotive look at it. And I mean, again, you know, it's something that I've noticed is that I find it much easier to get my point across when I'm in person with people. I mean, there's element that I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. You know, I could deconstruct the psychology behind that, but I much prefer to be in a room with people. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether that, you know, helps to balance the debate, or whether it, you know, that depends on a whole range of different factors. You know, I think, you know, it can vary depending on who's chairing the meeting, whether it's online or in person, you know, depending on who else is there, you know, what the agenda is, you know, what the topic of conversation is. So, as I say, you know, whether a change is good or bad will depend on a lot of different things and a lot of different factors. I think most of these changes, and most of the changes we've seen over COVID, have both positive and negative elements. And it's a question of how do we keep the positive and how do we focus on that while counteracting some of the more negative changes. And I think, for example, we're looking now at hybrid meetings. So how can we have an element where people can be in person, but other people can join remotely, which sort of brings together some of the benefits of both. It may also bring together some of the disadvantages of both as well. I think that there are still challenges with that. But it's, this is the nature of being human, right? We're constantly looking for better ways of doing things and acknowledging that those ways will never be perfect, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't an improvement on what went before.
So I'm going to ask possibly flammable, very difficult, but a question all the same. Do you think that irreparable damage has been done to the way that humans determine community by COVID?
I think irreparable is a big word, and I think humans are very adjustable. We adjusted to COVID, and I think we will adjust out of COVID. And things will not be the same. Things will be different. Okay, whether they will be better or worse, like I say, they will likely be better in some ways and worse in others. We'll have learned from it. I think I would be careful about saying irreparable damage, because one of the things I know as an osteopath is if you tell somebody that they have irreparable damage, that will affect how they behave, that will affect what they do, that will affect how they feel. And that in itself will tend to lead towards worse outcomes. So in a sense, if somebody's got some degenerative change in a joint, again, I hate the term degenerative change because that's emotive, it will never quite be the same as it was before in a physiological sense. But that doesn't mean that they can't get back to full function. It doesn't mean they can't have even better performance than they had before. I have patients who I see who tell me that they feel fitter and stronger than they've ever been. That they've actually, they've been dealing with these things for years. And while on a physiological level, that joint may have deteriorated because of what we've done to counteract that, because of the rehab we put in place, because of the other things that we've looked at, actually in practical terms, their experience of it is better than it was before. And I like to think of this one in the same way. I think things are different. Things will never be the same again. I think that's fairly true. But whether that turns out for better or worse has yet to be seen. How it all shakes out has yet to be seen. There are difficulties for sure. There are challenges, and there are some things which I'm incredibly worried about. I won't sugarcoat that, but at the same time, I think there are also opportunities, and we can't change what's gone. Just as if somebody's got osteoarthritis, you can't magically make that disappear. There are no treatments out there that will take that joint back in time to 20 years ago. But there are things that you can do that will affect the outcomes, and I think that's what we need to be focusing on, because that's the thing that we can control. That's where we have agency. And I had a sports psychologist who he said something that stuck with me, and I've always gone back to this: is control the controllables. There's no point worrying about the stuff that you can't control, because that's gone. That is what it is. We can mourn it, but we can't change it. But what we can do is change the outcomes we get in the future. And humans are adaptable. I firmly believe that. And there are all sorts of opportunities, and I think with the right will, I think we can look forward to a future that is better than the past. I'm not saying we're automatically going to end up there, but I'm saying that that is a possibility if we get our collective shit together.
Yeah, I think that's where we differ slightly, is that I think you are far more optimistic about the outcomes of this than I am.
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm optimistic, because I haven't expressed an opinion about the likelihood of getting a
Sure,
good
that's
outcome
true.
opposed to a bad outcome. I'm saying
Sure.
there is a possibility, and I
Sure.
think having that sense of possibility is important, because
Mhm.
you know it's, if I were a betting person, I don't think the odds are good. I will agree with you. You know,
All right, cool.
I mean, as I say, I'm incredibly worried about the direction that some of this is heading,
Yeah.
and the ability of any one individual or any small group of individuals to make change. Because I think there are some huge systemic problems, and at the moment, I have absolutely no idea how we get a handle on them. But I think having the sense that there is a possibility, even a remote one, that things can be better in future is an important thing to hold on to.
I
If you
agree.
don't believe that, why would you bother? You know, why turn up to meetings if it's inevitably going to end up being worse? You know, why keep fighting that battle if there is no prospect of success? So I think however unlikely it is, we've got to hold on to the fact that actually there is a possibility. And then, you know, as I say, you know, we're talking about probabilities, which is a whole different question. And yeah, you know, I fully accept that the odds are not good. You know, however, you know, I'm used to being an underdog, right? So
Sure.
you've
Sure.
you've got
Absolutely.
to keep fighting it. Because what else is there to do? But
I mean, I agree. I'm not saying, I'm not disagreeing with you in any of those points. Actually, I think um, I just look out at. I think the thing that you've said that's been really pertinent and sort of circles this whole conversation really nicely is the idea of fixing the local community, right? Because, and you know, now probably a time to talk about decentralized government, decentralized power, and all that stuff, but I feel like you as a community member can affect things at a much faster rate inside your community, right? Because you have tangible access to your community, you're able to do things a lot quicker. Whereas, as you've said, you know, trying to affect a policy could take weeks, months, years sometimes, right? And on top of that, when you add the circus of elections and this and that and the next thing, lots of things can get sort of lost in the wash. Whereas you can go out and you can physically talk to members of your community and actually change things, right? I feel like that's the route. If this tide is going, if the tide that I see, and just to clarify, the tide that I see is that we are losing the sense of what it is to be human, and we're adopting and accepting something else. I don't want to say that it's negative. I don't want to say it's positive. We're just adopting something else. We're choosing to be something else. You know, one of the intrinsic notions of being human that I was under the impression was one of the intrinsic notions of being human was interaction, right? Like physical interaction. And as we've sort of touched on, I feel like that's dying very rapidly. And if that dies, I think the subsidiary effects will be drastic. But I think re-interacting, reconnecting, and rekindling a local community is the way to fix this. Because if everyone undertook that challenge and everyone undertook that fight, the effects then would be cumulative, right?
I mean, I think in that respect, I'm maybe a little bit less pessimistic, because I do see, you know, local communities, and local communities take all different forms. You know, anything from your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club to a kids football team to, you know, a local, you know, park litter picking group to, you know, and these are going on all over the country, up and down. And I think people are itching to get back to seeing people face to face. That's something that I hear a lot. I think while people have accepted online as a means of getting by, I see very few people who want to continue doing that 100%. I think even, in workplaces, people have said, okay, well, I see the benefits of working from home some of the time, but actually I want to get back in the office, at least a few days a week, just so I can meet people, because I'm going crazy here. And I think the majority of people, even introverts like me, want to get back to seeing people face to face. And I think, it's been wonderful getting back. I felt a whole new lease of life almost. I've almost not realised how much I missed it during the the year we were at home. Is actually just getting back in a room with people, because it makes everything feel so much more purposeful. And I think people want to do that. We feel that urge. So I don't think, again, it's like if you invented a food substitute that had all the nutrients that people needed to survive on and handed it out for free to people, it wouldn't mean that, the people wouldn't still want to go out and eat, that people wouldn't still go and buy food, that people wouldn't still cook. These people, there's an urge to do those things. People have that. So I think that will spring back. I think we will see those communities again. And I think, again, we're still at a stage where there are restrictions in place. So we're not seeing that as much as we were before. There are still, some larger meetings are still being held online. There are things like that. But I do see people itching to get back in contact with family and friends in person. To have, and young people especially. People complain that for youngsters, it's almost like they don't understand social distancing, and I think, yeah, in a sense, that is problematic to a degree. But also, I think they have that really strong urge to connect person to person, and this is a generation that's grown up with technology. It's grown up with phones and remote conversations and things that happen over text. But they still want to get back in a room with their friends. They still want to be in contact. They want to go and have parties and events and things like that. So, and if young people, who are the most malleable of any of us, are feeling that way, I think it's true of all of us to a degree. So I don't think we'll see a situation where people don't want to connect. I think it's about trying to enable those relationships, if you like. And I think, I've seen a real sort of change in tone over the last year, because, when we first had lockdown, lots of people were saying, talking about people who were ignoring the restrictions as being irresponsible, and there was that real social pressure to conform to restrictions to protect people, and I get that, and I think what we're seeing now is people say, what, I agreed with this at first, but actually, now I think that's almost counteracted by some of the social issues that it's causing, and some of the, people often like to pick on mental health, and I'm a little bit wary of that, because I think that can be quite a I don't like people using mental health to make a case that actually is much wider than that. I think it ends up being used as a tool, which isn't really fair to either people who are suffering from mental health issues or to anyone else. But I think in general, on a well-being level, we all need that social interaction. And, I accept that there are still COVID concerns. I think, that we shouldn't underplay the dangers of the new variant, and there are issues there. But at the same time, I really think that people need people. People need people. and that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And I think sort of figuring out how we get back to that. And like I say, it may involve hybrid technology, hybrid conversation, hybrid meetings, and I think that's maybe a good outcome, because again, it enables some of those benefits of the that we experience from the online interaction, but integrating that back into person to person. So, I think there are definitely positives that can come out of this as well as negatives.
I think people need people is a fantastic place to end that. Like, I feel like I get this sense, the more podcasts that I do, I get this sense somebody, like, it's almost poetic, right? It's like a beautiful flourish to the end of a sentence. And I agree. I do, as I said, I do have fears about the way that society and communities are devolving, sort of on a slightly higher than macro level. But I think that you're right. In our current iteration as humans, people still need people.
Yeah. And this is something that I keep banging on about when I get those opportunities in meetings to talk about things. It's, because it's very easy to focus on the opportunities that technology presents and how can we use this to make things, if I'm being cynical, cheaper, or if I'm being less cynical, better for people. How can we use those resources more effectively? But at the same time, like I said, we can't lose sight of the fact that psychologically people need people. So yeah, I think we've got to keep sight of that.
Absolutely. Well, as always, thank you so much for your time. It's always an education. It's always an education, and one that I always really look forward to. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for your time.
It's great. It's great to chat and talk through some of those things, and I think it's it helps me to get an idea of where would be useful to focus. I think sometimes talking through those things enables you to crystallize those thoughts. So I think it's a good thing to do. We should all do that more.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely.
Even online.
Even online. Exactly. Even online. All right. Thank you very much.